Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today, we're talking about the U.S.'s 1867 purchase of Alaska from Russia and how that purchase had everything to do with not gold, not fur, get ready for it, fish. We'll hear about how a far-sighted clerk for the Washington Territorial Legislature urged that body to lobby the president and the Secretary of State to acquire Alaska, and how all of that helped transform the Pacific Northwest and its fishing industry. If you haven't already seen the video, you might take a few moments to watch it. It'll put this conversation in context and bring the Northwest fishing industry to life. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's jump in. Hook, line, and sinker. Knut, having grown up in Seattle as you did, fishing has always been a cultural center point. My family knew a lot of people who spent a lot of time in Alaska fishing. My cousins are in Haines, Alaska, and have spent their whole life in the fishing industry. And I had brothers and I had lots of friends who would either work in canneries here or go up to Alaska, work in canneries or fishing, hoping to make some college tuition money during the seasonal fisheries there. What was your experience as far as fishing growing up?
Well, it was just seafood and fishing were just kind of ubiquitous. I used to go fishing with my dad up in the San Juans, where the reef net boats would be out there catching salmon. You know, with a Norwegian and Scottish heritage that I have, both sides were fisher people. Mm-hmm. And people who were in fishery science, people who were working on fishing boats. And we have some names out there on the bricks at Fisherman's Terminal in Ballard. And of course, you know, Scandinavian Ballard is where the Alaska fishing fleet winters. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of a big deal. My sister went to the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and in the summers worked at a cannery in Naknek. So there were lots of connections with the fishing industry. We were never far away from it, very aware of it.
Yeah, Alaska just seemed to be the center point of all of this activity. You head to Alaska where the fish were so bountiful.
Well, and, you know, when you drive across the old Mercer Island, the Lacey V. Murrow floating bridge, as you entered the city, it says over the tunnel there, Gateway to Alaska. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I think that's something that Seattle, for many, many decades, built its reputation on. People would joke that Seattle was the southernmost city in Alaska. The connections between here and Alaska were incredibly important to our economy, to cultural exchange, to awareness, whether it's indigenous cultures or, fishery cultures and whatnot. There were a lot of connections.
And we had a World's Fair that was devoted to that idea. The 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition really celebrated this whole connection and the gateway to Alaska.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think of the components, Alaska, Yukon, Pacific. Well, what was that about? Pacific Rim, gold, the connections, other connections to Alaska, and the importance of it. The last frontier was in our backyard. The exploitation of resources up there was something that people were very excited about. And so, you know, in the 1890s, you saw this energy really begin to pick up with the discovery of gold, with steamship traffic going back and forth. We were connected. We were the place. If you wanted to go to Alaska, you came to Seattle and you left from here because we were the closest American port to Alaska. So, you know, that it was a huge factor in the growth of the city at that time and celebrated in lots of different ways.
So we hear about Seward's folly. William Henry Seward, the then Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration's idea to acquire Alaska. When did people start thinking about getting Alaska?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the Russians claimed Alaska as their territory. They had fur trading. They had explored some of the further reaches of Alaska. They had built a fort in Sitka. They were trading as far south as Northern California for furs. But this was at a time in the late 18th century, so we're talking about the 1790s. We're talking about a time when you had multiple empires vying for the Pacific Northwest and the North Pacific. And so you had Spain, which coming from the south, you had Russia coming from the north, and you had Britain and the United States competing over the Oregon Territory. And I think the idea, arrived in terms of like, what should America have? Let's talk about the American viewpoint. And the American viewpoint, as it evolved, especially with the opening of the Oregon country, the California gold rush, taking California from Mexico in the Mexican War, the idea, had originated earlier of like, wouldn't it be nice if we controlled the entire Pacific coast of North America?
Did this idea exist even before the Louisiana Purchase of 1803?
Yeah, well, it was back in that time when it was birthed. It was sort of seen as maybe a natural extension of the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, there was a lot of unknown about what was there or how far you could go. But there was also a maritime element, which is you had ships exploring up in that region, Captain Cook, Vancouver, the Russians. And so I think there was a period of time when it was sort of up for grabs, and it was like which imperial power was going to sort of seize control. So the Americans are thinking about it. There were treaties that permitted some limited access to Alaskan waters between the U.S. and Russia and and Britain and Russia. And there was, talk in the 1830s, 1840s of buying Alaska, but it never really gelled. There was stuff coming out of the North Pacific. We had whalers were going up there. There was some fur hunting and fur trading and whatnot. So we knew that there were resources up there, but nobody knew really what the scope of it was.
So Alaska was kind of theoretical still.
Yeah, it was.
As far as its size and what it was, the resources thereof.
Right. And the Russians had this kind of tenuous hold on it. They didn't have a lot of resources to pour into developing it. But the American expansion was bringing telegraph, it was bringing railroads, it was bringing a more robust maritime system. So things were in place where we could exploit something like Alaska if we so chose. So before the Civil War, Seward, who had been kind of a let's look at Alaska guy before he was in Lincoln's cabinet, but when he was Secretary of State, he was in a position where he thought maybe I could do something about this. But
before he was a senator from New York.
He was a senator from New York. And so he was intrigued, as were many senators in both parties. But there were also tons of skeptics, like, why do we want this chunk of unknown? We just, we bought the Louisiana Purchase. We haven't even developed that yet, So, Seward had some sense that the Russians were maybe looking to get out of it. They weren't committing to it, but the Civil War came along. And the Civil War interrupted the process of negotiating over Alaska.
Not a good time.
So Seward tried. He failed. But in the post-war period, there was perhaps the time when they could bring up buying Alaska or annexing Alaska, getting it somehow.
What role did the Washington Territory have in acquiring Alaska, and what was the catalyst? What was the thing that finally set things in motion?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because it's not well known. It's been written about in history, but not well known. So the Alaska Purchase was many years in the making. I mean, decades in the making, and discussions and treaties and all that. So there was a guy named Joseph Lane McDonald, an Irish immigrant, came to the United States. He was a seaman. He was involved in various walks of life. And he decided to head to the Pacific coast in the gold rush period. So we're talking about 1850s California. And he goes to San Francisco, and one of the things that he's interested in is this idea of a transcontinental railroad. Gee, we really need one of those. And of course,
Everybody was interested
everybody
in that.
was interested in that, had been for a long time. But this idea of exploiting the Pacific in the way that we'd exploited the Atlantic, this would be interesting. So he did a lot of research. He actually took a trip to Alaska by boat and went up there. And what he saw was just, this amazing potential in terms of fishing. So he's trying to get people interested in this idea of a railroad to Alaska, exploiting the fishery. And in the early 1860s, ships from San Francisco are going out to the Bering Sea and other places and coming back with these incredible loads of codfish. And they would salt it. So you're getting salt cod in San Francisco. It's a boom town. The gold rush is thriving. And, people from back east coming out to the West Coast, they're used to eating cod, a lot of New England, Canadian cod.
It is the fish, yeah.
It is the fish. It is the staple, more than salmon. And, of course, salmon was, by comparison, relatively more prevalent, but not heavily commercialized. So salt cod is suddenly in the markets. There's a huge appetite for it. And this triggers this idea, which is we could really make a lot of money if we could own that. So Joseph Lane McDonald ends up in Washington. And he is trying to convince people of these various dreams and schemes that he has. He's writing for newspapers. He gets a job as a clerk at the Washington Territorial Legislature. He's a literate guy and a very odd character, apparently. I found a description of him. There's only one article I've ever found that goes into some depth about him, because there's a lot about him that's kind of not known. And there's an article from 1921 in the Washington Historical Quarterly. And here's the description of this guy. His appearance here as described by persons yet living. So the author of this article talked to people who knew Joseph Lane McDonald.
People say.
Yeah. Was most theatrical. His body was short, his shoulders enormous, and his head, the face of which was deeply pitted, formed union with the trunk without semblance of a neck. His manners bespoke his person. Adults turned to take a second look and children to stare as he passed by. Some thought him a wonderful man, but others a half-wit. Even bad. How he made a living nobody knew, though it was gossiped that he was a seller of whiskey to Indians and a smuggler, callings not held in such ill repute then as now. So, he's out there promoting this idea that we need to get our fishing fleet, such as it is, access to Russian waters.
But was he a profiteer? Is he somebody who personally wanted to make money exploiting this idea and the resource, or was he a thinker, a visionary?
Well, I think he was both. I think.
But then he became a clerk, a lowly clerk for the legislature.
You're politically connected. A clerk in the legislature is somebody who's writing legislation, who's editing it, who's getting to know the political figures. And he realizes that in order to get access to Alaskan waters for American fishermen, Washington is in the best position to do that. We're closest to Alaska. And he knows that the resource is there. He also knows that, this is the era of big dreams, where you have a lot of entrepreneurs coming along saying, well, what we need to do is, we need to, in his case, we need to get access to the fish in Alaska, but that's just the half of it. We need to get our shipping fleet going up there. We need to get a railroad connecting us with Alaska directly. So he's also trying to create a railroad company and a steamship company that would unite all this and make big money possible. He wasn't the only one thinking about that. And he basically got outmaneuvered by other people who created steamship companies and whatnot that could exploit the resource. But he convinces the Washington legislature to pass, basically they called it a memorial, a request for the government to get them access. And one thing back in that period, it's still true now, if industry wants something, and if you can get a bunch of local businessmen and political leaders to say, hey, you need to do this and here's why, that can be very effective. At this time, Lincoln has been assassinated, so we're in the later 1860s. So he has the legislature draft a memorial that he basically wrote and send it to President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State, is still William Henry Seward. He writes to Seward and says, hey, we've got this memorial. It's going to be signed in a few weeks. I'm giving you a look at it. And the legislature of the territory of Washington wants Alaska. They want access. He doesn't say purchase Alaska, a treaty, something. He wants permission for us to fish there, to repair our ships, to be able to go wherever we want.
Do you think he was aware that Seward was very interested in this very idea all along?
Yes. Yeah. I think many people were. And
Seward probably spoke about it and wrote about it.
It had been spoken about, it had been written about, it had been debated in Congress, the wisdom of it. But the post-war situation is different than the pre-war situation. And expansion is happening anyway, right? I mean, the Transcontinental Railroad, both under Lincoln, Johnson, this is the era of where the expansion technologically is really taking off. Well, Seward is known when he was in the Senate, when he was in the cabinet, as a very, crafty, experienced, knowledgeable, knows how things are done in Washington. And he sees this thing as kind of a godsend. Here is a document I can take to skeptical congressmen. And I can say, look, the territory out in Washington really needs this. We have a constituency here that wants us to get this off the dime. And that's what happens.
So we buy Alaska.
Yeah.
The deal is done.
We write a check.
For $7.2 million, which seems incredibly cheap because I Googled this, and 7.2 in 1867 is equal to about 157 million today, which is about what we'd spent on the First Avenue streetcar if we get that done.
Right.
So to me, it says again that Alaska for a lot of people was just a theory. They had no idea what was there, how big it was. They had absolutely no idea. So, but not everybody was for this, right?
No, I mean, there were a lot of people who just thought this was a waste of money. The government had spent a ton of money on the war. Why are we outlaying for this largely blank area on the map? Because people were somewhat aware of the inner passage, the coastline, but the interior was a complete unknown. And so it's like you're buying a bunch of icebergs, maybe some walruses. What are you doing? And that's why it became called Seward's Folly. That was considered a very, very foolish act. But it was front page news. I've gone back and looked through what were the headlines April 1st. Wasn't April Fool's Day at the time, I guess. April 1st of 1867.
We bought Alaska. Yeah, sure.
It's announced, and it's front page news in all the papers, the New York Times and others. And in the coverage in many newspapers, Seward has released this document from the Washington Territorial Legislature pleading with the government to solve this problem of access to Alaska. So he's using the Washington thing. It not only helped trigger the purchase, getting it going again, it provided him with some political leverage, but he's also using it as PR at the time to justify what people are criticizing.
So he noted that the Washington legislature was instrumental, and therefore McDonald was instrumental in this purchase.
Yeah, it's interesting. McDonald's name has dropped out of this thing. He's behind the scenes guy. He's the guy who contacted Seward. He's the guy who wrote this and got the legislature to pass this memorial, which begins with cod in the very first sentence. The memorial reads, "In reference to cod and other fisheries, your memorialists, the Legislative Assembly of Washington Territory, beg leave to show that abundance of lead fish, halibut, and salmon of excellent quality have been found along the shores of the Russian possessions." So the whole justification is built on, we want access to fuel, to water, to provisions. We want our sick and disabled fishermen to obtain sanitary assistance. So, they basically want to treat Alaska as theirs. They don't want to be hindered in any way from pursuing the collection of fish up there.
When did this deal stop being called Seward's Folly, and when did it finally start making sense to Americans?
Yeah, well, I think my sense of it is that it was the gold rush, the Klondike gold rush, that really changed the perception.
So the
the access.
1890s.
1890s. And, certainly there were people who were going up to Alaska shortly after the purchase to settle, to explore, to try to capitalize on resources. But you begin to get the infrastructure. By the 1880s, you're getting massive canneries. You're getting the technology for processing fish and being able to send it outside the Pacific Northwest. Canned salmon being, a huge deal. And then as you get into the gold rush period, you're getting a lot of regular shipping access going certainly from the gold fields to San Francisco. So the whole coast is now involved in the gold business, but also supplying. We're building infrastructure up there. We're building ships that can go up there and come back and continue. And fishing follows that. The technology is changing. You have the development of diesel engines, not just steam engines. And so you get a fishery that's built on small kind of fishing vessels that are sort of like the family farms afloat, right? A family can get a fishing vessel. They can go up to Alaska. They can make a ton of money in a season. Canneries are expanding. They can get sell the stuff. There's a ready market for it. And then they can come back and take the winter off. And there's just so much up there that's exploitable. And so, when you get into the early 20th century, the whole the volume of everything sort of begins to inch its way toward 11,
And so that's when Puget Sound and Seattle became really part of the Alaskan fishing industry.
Yeah, I think it goes on kind of right on the coattails of the gold rush because, there's a whole question about, why did the Klondike gold rush, which was in Canada, British territory, why did Seattle become the base for that? San Francisco, Portland, Victoria, Vancouver, there are all kinds of places that could have been the jumping off place. Became Seattle partly through marketing, partly because the railroads were finally here. We were the closest American port to American territory in Alaska. That made a big difference. You didn't have the customs issues that you had with Canada, for example. So the gold rush turned us into the base camp or the gateway. And of course, while codfish had been the sort of leading product, there was now gold. There was now mineral wealth. There was more to exploit, more to develop. And so, people began to look at that. When, you think about 1897, when the gold ship came to Seattle and offloaded a so-called ton of gold. It was actually more like 2 tons. It's no longer folly, right? And the ongoing relationship with the fishery up there, as our fishing stocks deplete in the Pacific Northwest, there's still enormous abundance up there. And, it becomes this mainstay for Seattle where we have the fishing fleet, we have this active maritime industry, it's modernizing, and we're just, well located and, frankly, entrepreneurial. People seize the opportunity.
When we talk about manifest destiny and the purchase of these territories and that national impulse to expand, I can't help but compare it to a similar contemporary manifest destiny impulse that exists today, this idea that the U.S. could possibly acquire Greenland.
We need Greenland for national security and even international security.
Or the idea that Canada should become the 51st state.
So I'd love to see that, but some people say that would be a long shot.
Or other claims and ideas. Do you see a resemblance there, and what does that say?
Well, yeah, I mean, the expansionism in the United States, as well as Russia, China, other countries, it hasn't gone away, right? And we clearly see the Pacific Rim. I mean, that puts it in this kind of, they're our trading partners and we're going to be important figures in that trade and that kind of thing. But, we went to war to get the Philippines and to get various islands here. Hawaii ended up a state. Alaska ended up a state. There's now talk about Guam becoming a state. This is because we perceive other countries as vying for the ocean that we want to control.
And it's about resources.
It is about, of course, it always comes to that. It always comes to resources. And so now you have this new competition taking place in the Arctic. And, the early explorers who came to the Pacific Northwest, Captain Cook chief among them, they were looking for the Northwest Passage. They were looking for a shortcut across North America between the Atlantic and Pacific. And the idea was if you could link those two, you could commercialize, you could make a lot of money, you could shorten these travel times, and we would have direct access to European markets. The Northwest Passage was a big deal. And then, but the North remained frozen. Up into the early 20th century, it was still icebound. Well, now, with global warming, changing climate, it's open and easy to access relatively. Well, this opens up a whole strategic question. Mm-hmm. Who controls the Arctic? Who controls the Northwest Passage? Russia controls the Northeast Passage because the country extends significantly there. America has a piece of it because of Alaska. Canada has a huge piece of it because of how it's situated. And then the Scandinavian countries, Norway and Denmark, they have pieces of it. Territorial claims, when I say pieces of it, I mean territorial claims. And China wants to have access and are claiming some rights to the Northwest Passage. So you're seeing something very similar to what was happening in the early 19th century, the late 18th century, this jockeying for domination of not only the Pacific, but the top of the world.
In your mind, how would things have turned out if the U.S. had not acquired Russia? Can you imagine?
You mean acquired Alaska?
I'm sorry, yeah. We haven't acquired Russia yet. Just give us time.
Yeah.
How would have things turned out if the U.S. had not acquired Alaska?
Well, that would be really interesting from an economic standpoint, because so much of the Pacific Northwest's and Seattle in particular, our economy tied to Alaska, that wouldn't have existed. And certainly, if other factors of history played out the way they have, it would have been a huge security issue for Canada and for the United States to have what essentially during the Cold War was an enemy right on our border. I mean, there's the old Sarah Palin thing. I can see Russia from my house, But that's very different if, you're on the other side of the Aleutian chain versus imagining, Russia where Southeast Alaska is.
Whatever happened to Joseph Lane McDonald? Do we know?
Not really. We know a little bit. So he stuck around. I found a reference to him in a newspaper in the 1880s. So his proposal to create the steamship line went kaput. He got outmaneuvered by more powerful legislative forces. And I don't think he was a guy who could really, I don't think he was sort of a big enough fish in order to parlay this. He pretty much got written out of the story. I think he went up to Alaska at some point, and this clipping I saw from the 1880s, he was submitting to a Congress or a representative of some kind in Washington, D.C., a proposal to allow mammal hunting in Alaska. So there was apparently a period where that was not allowed or was sort of in jeopardy. Could we legally go up there and slaughter, walruses and that kind of thing? It's just a brief mention in a thing. And in the more extensive history, he basically is, said to have gone back east. I think somewhat disillusioned is sort of the implication. And then he just drops out of history. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what happened to him, and the historian who's written most about him doesn't seem to know either.
This story is interesting because it just deals with these macro developments, these geopolitics, but it's really this one person who's at the center of it, who can make a huge difference.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, the historian who wrote the story of this for the Washington Quarterly in the 1920s, UW professor, he wrote a follow-up piece to it a year later. And I don't know whether he took flack for, giving Joseph Lane McDonald such a high profile, but he basically says in this piece, without mentioning him by name, of course, these things don't happen because of one person. And then he goes into the whole backstory of all the treaty negotiations and whatnot. So he's covering decades of interest and concern and politics around the Alaska Purchase. But, if somebody as key to the whole story as William Henry Seward says, this is the guy who gave me the ammo I needed to make the breakthrough on this. And he's the obscure Irishman from Washington Territory who had this vision that other people ignored. And, credit him with that. He said this memorial that McDonald had written was a foundation of the Alaska Purchase. It's the foundation of it. You have to take that seriously.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 11th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And now, if you prefer to watch your podcasts, you're in luck. Head to YouTube to see a brand new video version of the Mossback podcast. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Studio recording and setup by Rusty Bacall, Victoria Ralph, Roger Basquette, Lucy Barrera, Yamina Stiet, and Matt Brott. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, local news, and more. Plus, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.